Another day, another solution. Let's talk dirt. So today's setup is this. Two people get divorced and they divide everything, or at least so they thought. But accidentally, they leave the house out of the decree. What does a divorced couple do now? What happens next? What does a Texas court do with that? So Frank comes into my office and he says, Rick, we got divorced a few years ago. We did it ourselves. We agreed on everything. We got the kids handled, accounts divided, personal property split. And then he says, but we left the house out of the decree. Not on purpose. It just didn't make it in. And Frank's looking at me like, this is fixable, right? So here's where people get tripped up. Up until recently, attorneys would have considered the property left out of the divorce decree as community property. In other words, even though the divorce was final, the property left out of the decree would have just stayed as community property, waiting to be handled later. The Texas Supreme Court now has clarified that property that is left out of a decree is no longer community property. So in this situation, timing matters. After a divorce decree is signed by the court keeps control of the case for about 30 days. That's in law called plenary power. In other words, that's the time period that the court has to fix any mistakes they may have made. If anyone catches a mistake during that window, then the court can usually fix it. But once those 30 days pass, the divorce is final. And the court loses the power at that point to just correct what was left out. That's when the rules change. Once the divorce becomes final and the house was omitted, Texas law treats those former spouses as what's called tenants in common. Now that sounds technical, but it's pretty simple. That means that the divorced individuals own the house together the same way a brother and sister would, or maybe cousins, or two unrelated people who bought the property together. In other words, they're still co-owners, but now under Texas property law, they're no longer under Texas divorce law. At this point, the court does not reopen the divorce. So now at that point, the only way to divide the house is through what's called a partition lawsuit. That's the same process that's used when co-owners can't agree whether to sell, divide, or buy each other out. Now, in this situation, there's a twist. Even though we're dealing with a partition case now, the Texas Supreme Court says that the court still has to divide the property in a just and right manner. So in this situation, you get a hybrid. We're going to use property law procedure, but we're going to use the same family law standards that the divorce court would have used originally. So at this point, let's turn back to Frank. I need to start asking some questions. Who's living in the house? Who's paying the mortgage? Who's paying taxes and insurance? Who's handling the repairs? Not because anyone messed up in this situation, but at this point, it's because once the decree is silent, those facts decide the outcome. Intent no longer matters. Evidence does. This is the part that people underestimate. Leaving real estate out of a divorce, whether it was intentional or a complete accident, it can be incredibly time-consuming and very expensive. Even a simple partition where everyone agrees, that can cost thousands of dollars in legal fees, court costs, and delays. And if the parties don't agree, that same case can easily turn into tens of thousands of dollars, and it can drag on for months and sometimes years. All over a problem that could have been handled cleanly inside the divorce decree. Hopefully this video makes it clear why leaving real estate out of a divorce isn't a small mistake. Texas law doesn't fill in missing terms for you. And remember, if it's not in the decree, the court treats you like any other co-owners who now have to sort it out in court. It is fixable, but only if it's handled the right way. If this video helped you, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and stick around. Remember, this is your channel. We're having real conversations about relevant dirt law issues in Texas. If you've got a question, a situation you're dealing with, or a topic you want us to cover, drop it in the comments or send it our way. We read them, and we may turn yours into a future episode. Remember, Real estate legal issues are not a do-it-yourself project. Texas law is unforgiving, and you generally don't get two bites at the apple. So do it right the first time. As always, thank you for tuning in.